Dean Martin broke down at Sammy Davis Jr.'s funeral, what he whispered moments before. The world had watched him vanish after his son's jet fell from the sky, taking Dean Paul Martin and the last light in Dean's life with it. No more interviews. No more songs. No more King of Cool. Only silence thick enough to swallow a legend whole. And then came May 18th, 1990. The day he broke that silence, not for a stage, not for a camera, but for a funeral. The sun should have been gentle that Thursday morning in Beverly Hills, but instead it glared down like it didn't care what kind of day this was. Forest Lawn Memorial Park shimmered in the heat, the lawns unervingly green, the sky painfully blue, as though the world had decided to mock the people gathering in black. Sammy Davis Jr. was gone, and Hollywood felt smaller because of it. Limousines rolled through the cemetery gates like a parade of grief. Icons stepped out one by one, Liza Minnelli, Stevie Wonder, Quincy Jones, each carrying their own private collapse behind their sunglasses. They hugged, whispered, avoided looking at the casket, pretended their hands weren't shaking. But even among giants, people sensed an absence. No one expected Dean Martin. He hadn't set foot in public since 1987. His manager couldn't coax him. His friends couldn't reach him. Vegas had begged him. The studios had begged him. The world had begged him. And Dean simply disappeared. But grief has its own way of dragging the dead back into the light. It started with a phone call. A call Frank Sinatra dreaded making. "Dino." Frank's voice cracked before he even said the words. "Sammy's gone." Silence stretched between them, the kind that wasn't empty, the kind that hurt. Dean breathed unevenly, like even that took effort. "I don't know if I can do it, Frank." His voice was raw, thin, barely a shadow of what it once was. "I don't know if I can watch another brother go into the ground." Frank closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose. He hadn't begged for anything in decades. But now, "Please, Dino. For Sammy. He loved you. He'd want you there." More silence. A slow inhale. A slower exhale. Then Dean whispered something that hit Frank like ice down the spine. "When I lost my boy, I lost my heart. When I lost Sammy, I lost my soul. What's left of me to bring?" Frank had no answer. None. But he also knew Dino would come. Even broken men keep their promises. On the morning of the funeral, Rosa, Dean's housekeeper of 11 years, found him standing motionless inside his closet. The door was open, but he wasn't looking at the clothes. Not really. His eyes drifted over empty hangers, untouched shoes, forgotten suits, artifacts of a life he didn't recognize anymore. He reached for a black suit, the same one he'd worn to his son's funeral. Rosa stepped toward him, voice soft. "Mr. Martin, are you sure you want to go?" Dean didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The tension in his shoulders said everything. Finally, he nodded, a slow, hollow motion. "I have to," he murmured. "I owe him that much." Rosa helped him dress. His jacket hung loose on him. He'd lost weight he didn't have to lose. His hands trembled when he tried fastening his cufflinks. She did it for him gently, as though he might break if she moved too fast. And maybe he would. When his car pulled up to Forest Lawn, cameras exploded like gunfire. Paparazzi pressed against the rope line, desperate to capture the first sighting of Dean Martin in over 1,000 days. He flinched at the flashes. Marcus, his bodyguard, steadied him with a hand on his arm. "Mr. Martin." "Dean, how are you feeling?" someone shouted. Dean stopped, slowly turned, looked at the man. The years had carved themselves into Dean's face, the weight of 2 funerals already behind him, a third in front of him. He wasn't the king of cool now. He was just a man who'd run out of places to hide. "How do you think I'm feeling?" barely more than a whisper. Then he walked on. Inside the chapel, the atmosphere thickened instantly. 500 people filled the seats, shoulder to shoulder, breath to breath. Conversations halted when Dean stepped through the doors. It was like watching a ghost return to its body. People stared. Some gasped. A few covered their mouths. He didn't react. He didn't blink. He simply moved toward the back row, each step a quiet battle against gravity. At the front of the chapel, Frank Sinatra turned at the movement. Their eyes met across the sea of mourners. Frank's face tightened, a small, trembling exhale escaping him. Dean nodded once. Frank nodded back. 40 years of friendship passed between them without a single word. The service began. Voices rose. Music swelled. People cried. Dean Martin did not move. He was there in body, but his soul was still standing in a closet that morning, staring at a suit from 3 years ago. And the moment that would shatter him hadn't even arrived yet. The chapel lights dimmed as Reverend Jesse Jackson stepped up to the podium, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of the moment. He spoke about Sammy's brilliance, how he danced through prejudice, sung through pain, smiled through battles most people never even knew he fought. His words echoed across the room, but to Dean, they felt distant, like he was hearing them from underwater. He stared straight ahead, unblinking. A statue carved from loss. Stevie Wonder performed "Ribbon in the Sky," and the sound of his voice wrapped around the audience like a prayer. People wept freely. Shoulders shook. Even the hardest men in the room wiped at their eyes. But Dean, nothing. No movement. No expression. Not even a swallow. It wasn't detachment. It was survival. The moment he let anything through, everything would come through. Next came Liza Minnelli. When she stepped to the microphone, her hands trembled. "He was a father to me," she whispered, and then she broke. Her voice cracked, her words dissolved, and she covered her mouth as tears poured down her face. The audience cried with her. Frank bowed his head. Even the security guards looked away. Dean still didn't move. But a muscle in his jaw twitched, the smallest slip in the mask. Then it was Frank Sinatra's turn. He walked slowly to the podium, every step betraying the weight of 74 years and a lifetime of outliving the people who made that life worth something. He gripped the edges of the podium and stared at his notes. Then he slid them aside. "Sammy Davis Jr., Frank said, was the greatest entertainer who ever lived." A murmur passed through the room, not disagreement, but recognition. "But more than that, he was my friend. My brother." His voice cracked on the word brother. Frank inhaled deeply, steadying himself, but the tremor stayed. "We did everything together. Me, Sammy, Dino. We owned Vegas. We owned every room we walked into. We laughed like fools. We fought like idiots. We drank more than we should have. We lived like kings." A sad smile touched his face, but it didn't last. "And Sammy always said we were untouchable." The room went silent. Frank looked up. His eyes found Dean's in the back row. "But time," Frank whispered, "touches everyone. And loss breaks even the strongest of us." Dean's grip tightened on the pew, knuckles turning bone white. He didn't look away, but he didn't look up either. Frank cleared his throat, voice shaking now. "Sammy used to tell me, 'Charlie, don't you dare cry for me when I go. I lived 10 lifetimes in one.'" Frank let out a shaky breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "Well, Sammy, you son of a gun, you did just that. You lived." And right there, in front of 500 people, Frank Sinatra broke. The chairman of the board, the man who could stare down presidents and gangsters, the man who sang "My Way" like a challenge to the universe, bowed his head and sobbed. His body trembled. His shoulders shook. His hand pressed over his eyes as if trying to physically hold himself together. A murmur rippled through the room, not shock, but heartbreak. Security moved toward him. Frank waved them off through tears. "I'm okay. I'm okay." But he wasn't. "Sammy would have kicked my ass for crying like this," Frank said with a broken laugh. Soft, sad laughter drifted through the chapel, the kind shared by people who had no idea what else to do with the pain. Frank wiped his cheeks, but the tears kept coming. "I'm crying because I loved him," he said simply. "I'm crying because I already miss him. And I'm crying because the Rat Pack, the real Rat Pack, it's almost gone now." A hush fell over the room. "It's just me and Dino left." His voice cracked again. "And I don't know how much longer we can keep pretending we're okay." Every head turned, subtly, quietly, toward Dean Martin. Dean didn't move, didn't blink. But inside, something sharp twisted. A memory struck him like a blow. The Sands Hotel, 1960. The showroom bursting with cigarette smoke and stardust. Sammy, sweat shimmering on his brow after finishing Mr. Bojangles, pulled Frank and Dean backstage. His grin was wide enough to lift the room. "You know what, cats?" Sammy said breathlessly. "We're immortal. The three of us. As long as we're together, we live forever." Dean had laughed then, real laughter, not the hollow echoes he produced later in life. "Forever's a long time, Smokey." Sammy winked. "Then let's make it count, baby." And they did. 4 decades. And now they were down to 2 tired men trying to hold on to ghosts. The service continued, but to Dean, everything blurred. Voices muffled. Faces softened out of focus. He was drifting somewhere between memory and reality when a hand touched his shoulder. "Dino," Frank whispered. "It's time." Dean looked up. Their eyes locked. The mask, the one Dean had worn every day since 1987, cracked. Pain leaked through. "I can't do this, Frank." His voice trembled. "I can't watch them put him in the ground." Frank swallowed hard. "I know," he whispered. "But we have to. For him." Dean closed his eyes. A long, trembling breath. Then he stood. Frank steadied him. 2 old lions walking toward a grave neither was ready to face. They didn't know it yet, but the hardest moment was waiting for Dean outside. Outside the chapel, sunlight cut sharply across the pavement, too bright, too cheerful for a gathering like this. It felt wrong, like the sky hadn't gotten the message. Flowers lined the path, arranged with care, but the colors looked almost neon against the grief tightening around the crowd. Sammy's casket emerged first. 6 pallbearers carried it, their faces solemn, movements deliberate. Quincy Jones walked alongside Reverend Jesse Jackson, the 2 men exchanging a brief nod before stepping forward to guide the processional. The casket gleamed, covered in white roses, Sammy's favorite, each petal catching the morning light like a quiet blessing. Dean Martin stood beside Frank, hands at his sides, shoulders rigid. His breathing was uneven now, shallow, as though the air refused to enter his lungs. People noticed. They watched him carefully, not out of curiosity, but something closer to dread. Dean Martin was the man who never cracked, the icon who handled everything with a smirk and a cocktail. But the man standing at the graveside looked like he might shatter if anyone touched him too hard. Frank leaned close, voice low. "Stay with me, Dino. Just stay standing. That's all you need to do." Dean nodded, barely. The crowd formed a circle around the gravesite, 500 mourners holding themselves together out of sheer will. Somewhere in the distance, children played in a park, their laughter sailing over the hill like an insult or a reminder. Dean couldn't tell which. Life kept going, indifferent to the ruins left behind. The Reverend stepped forward to say the final prayer. People bowed their heads. Some whispered goodbyes. Others clutched tissues, sunglasses, or each other. Dean stared straight ahead, unblinking. Not at the Reverend. Not at the flowers. Not even at the faces around him. His eyes were locked on the casket. The last link to his last brother. The final piece of a world that had already ended for him. Then the mechanism lowered, slow and deliberate. A soft mechanical whir. A creak of metal. A ripple of movement in the crowd. Dean's chest tightened, breath catching as though a hand had closed around his throat. He felt Frank glance at him, a cautious, searching look, but Dean didn't move. Couldn't. The casket sank inch by inch, slipping out of the sunlight, into the shadow of the earth. Someone behind him sniffed. Someone else whispered a prayer. Dean heard none of it. The world had narrowed to a single point, the last glimpse of Sammy's coffin before the ground swallowed it. Everyone expected Dean to step back, to bow his head, to hide behind his sunglasses the way legends do. Instead, he stepped forward. A soft gasp traveled through the crowd as people instinctively parted to let him through. Dean moved slowly, each step measured, deliberate, like walking through water. His hands shook at his sides. His breathing quickened. His lips pressed together to keep them from trembling. Frank watched him, eyes wide with worry. "Dino," he whispered under his breath. But Dean didn't stop. He reached the edge of the grave just as the casket settled at the bottom. He stared into the hole, a dark, quiet place that felt too familiar. Memories rose uninvited. His son's funeral. The smell of wet earth. The sound of shovels. The numbness. The crowd speaking in hushed voices, unsure if the great Dean Martin would cry. He hadn't. Not then. Not once in 3 years. Not for anyone to see. But now, standing over Sammy's grave, something inside him began to tear. His voice broke the silence. Barely audible. Barely a breath. "Sammy." Frank's head jerked up. People froze. "You told me," Dean whispered, "we'd always be together. The 3 of us." His throat tightened. "You said we'd go out on top." A bitter, cracked laugh escaped him. "But you left, Sam." People began to cry, quietly, helplessly. "You left me. And I—" His voice strangled itself. "I don't know how to do this without you." Frank stepped closer, his heart already breaking. Tears streamed freely down his cheeks now, no attempt to hide them. Dean's shoulders began to shake. He lifted a trembling hand and rested it lightly against the edge of the grave, fingers brushing the cold metal rails. "You were my right arm, Sam." His breath hitched. "When my boy died, I lost my heart." A sob broke out somewhere in the crowd. Dean swallowed hard, tried to speak again, but the words came out fractured. "And now you're gone and I'm just half a man now." His knees buckled. Frank lunged forward. Quincy Jones and another man reached too. They caught Dean before he fell, holding him upright as his body convulsed with years of swallowed grief. And in that moment, the king of cool crumbled. Not in silence. Not behind closed doors. But here, beside his brother's grave, surrounded by a world that had once adored him. He sobbed, deep, guttural, devastating sounds that came from a place no one had ever been allowed to see. "I can't do this," Dean choked out. "I can't lose anyone else. I can't." Frank held him close, gripping him as though holding a man who was slipping off a cliff. "I know, Dino," he whispered, voice trembling. "I know. I'm here. I'm still here." But Dean wasn't listening. He was drowning, not in the moment, but in 8 years of grief, loneliness, and love he never knew how to express. His world had ended twice. This was just the moment he finally stopped pretending he could survive it. Dean's sobs didn't echo, they thudded, heavy and raw, as if the earth itself absorbed them out of mercy. His body trembled violently, years of untouched grief finally clawing their way out. Frank held him tighter, his own tears spilling freely. Quincy steadied Dean's other side, whispering something no one could hear. But Dean wasn't in that cemetery anymore. He was in the cockpit of his son's jet, imagining the terror before the crash. He was backstage at the Sands, hearing Sammy's laughter ringing through the halls. He was alone in his mansion, replaying old recordings of himself, a voice he no longer possessed. He was everywhere but here, scattered across the wreckage of a life he once lived. "Dean," Frank murmured into his shoulder. "Dino, breathe. Just breathe." But Dean shook his head violently, tears slipping down his face in broken streaks. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't keep doing this, Frank. I can't keep burying the people I love." The words weren't just grief. They were confession. Surrender. A man laying down his last weapon after a lifetime of surviving behind charm and bourbon. Frank closed his eyes. Hearing Dean say it, really say it, wasn't just heartbreaking. It was terrifying. For decades, Dean had been the unbreakable one. The cool one. The unshakable center of the Rat Pack storm. And now he was unraveling in Frank's arms, piece by piece. The mourners watched with aching silence. Some clutched each other. Some wiped their eyes. Some turned away, not out of disrespect, but because watching Dean Martin break felt like witnessing a pillar crumble. Reporters lowered their cameras. Photographers who had spent their lives chasing scandal suddenly felt the invasion too cruel. This wasn't a celebrity moment. This was a man destroyed. A few feet back, Stevie Wonder pressed a hand to his mouth. Liza Minnelli shook her head, tears streaming. Quincy whispered, "Oh God, Dino!" Reverend Jackson bowed his head, murmuring a prayer. The entire circle tightened, as if the universe itself was trying to hold Dean together through sheer proximity. But Dean was gone, lost in the surge of agony he'd held back for 3 long years. He tried to speak again, voice shredded. "I can't, I don't." He pressed a fist to his chest. "It hurts, Frank. It never stops hurting." Frank's hands framed his face, forcing Dean to look at him. The chairman of the board, the commander of rooms, the man who scared presidents, had tears running down his cheeks like a child. "I know, pal," Frank whispered. "I know. I miss him too. I miss all of them." Dean's eyes were red, glassy, unfocused. "You're all I've got left, Frank," he breathed. "I can't lose you too." Frank's mouth trembled. A soft, tremulous exhale escaped him. He pulled Dean into a tighter embrace, resting his cheek against Dean's temple. "I'm not going anywhere," Frank whispered. "I'm right here, brother. We walk out of this together." The phrase "together" struck something in Dean, a word Sammy used to say, a word the Rat Pack had lived by. They had been kings. Untouchable. A trio stitched together by talent, chaos, and love. And now they were 2 broken old men, clinging to each other beside a grave that felt like the end of an era. Slowly, painfully, Dean's sobs began to soften. Not stop. Just shift from violent to exhausted. The kind of sobs that drained rather than erupted. Frank kept his arm around him, steadying him as Dean wiped at his eyes with shaking fingers. "I shouldn't have come," Dean whispered. Frank shook his head. "No, Dino, you had to come. He wanted you here." Dean's voice faltered. "I wasn't strong enough for it." Frank almost laughed, not with humor, but with disbelief. "You stood at the edge of your brother's grave and told the truth. That's strength, pal. The kind most men never show." Dean looked away, jaw trembling again. "I don't feel strong." "You're not supposed to," Frank said. He squeezed Dean's shoulder. "Not today." As they began guiding Dean back toward the cars, the crowd instinctively cleared a path, not out of formality, but respect. Every face they passed wore the same expression: heartbreak. Dean moved like a man underwater, each step labored, as if gravity had doubled. Frank kept a hand on his back. "Easy. I've got you." Marcus, Dean's bodyguard, stepped forward to take his arm, but Dean recoiled slightly, gripping Frank instead. Only Frank. Only the last surviving brother. When they reached the limousine, Dean paused. His reflection stared back at him from the dark window. Hollow eyes, streaked cheeks, a suit that no longer fit. He barely recognized the man. Frank opened the door for him. Dean hesitated, looking back once more toward the grave, the white roses, the lowered casket, the crowd saying their final goodbyes. A single tear slid down his cheek. The last one he had the strength to shed. Then he whispered under his breath, a whisper only Frank heard. "Goodbye, Smokey." He stepped into the car. The door closed, and the world outside kept moving, unaware of the fracture that had just carved itself into Hollywood history. But the story wasn't finished, because Dean Martin would never fully return from this day, and everyone who loved him knew it. The limousine pulled away from Forest Lawn, its tinted windows swallowing Dean Martin from the world. Inside, the air felt thick and unmoving. Dean sat slumped in the corner of the back seat, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. His breath was ragged, his tie pulled loose, his hands still trembling from the collapse he couldn't stop, the collapse he never thought he'd let anyone see. Frank sat beside him, silent. Not out of discomfort, not out of awkwardness, but because the moment demanded silence, a silence that allowed grief to breathe, rather than burying it under words. Dean finally whispered, "I'm sorry you had to see that." Frank shook his head slowly. "Don't be sorry, Dino. I'd rather see you break than watch you disappear." Dean closed his eyes. The lines on his face deepened, not from age, but from the weight of what he'd carried alone for so long. "Did Sammy know?" Dean murmured. "Know what?" "That I loved him like a brother." Frank swallowed, looking away as emotion tightened his jaw. "Dino, everyone who ever saw you two together knew." A small, broken laugh escaped Dean. "Yeah, well, I should have said it more." Frank didn't respond. Some truths were too sharp to touch. When the limo reached Dean's house, Marcus came around to open the door. Dean stepped out slowly, his body depleted, his spirit drained. Rosa waited at the entrance, hands clasped nervously. "Mr. Martin," she whispered. Dean paused, eyes softening just a little. "I'm all right, Rosa," he lied gently. But she saw the truth. Everyone did. Inside the quiet house, Dean stopped at the base of the staircase. The hallways seemed longer now, colder. Shadows clung to the edges of framed photographs. The Rat Pack, his children, moments captured before tragedy carved itself into the timeline. He touched a photo of Sammy on a table near the stairs, laughing, mid-dance, frozen in a joy that felt like another lifetime. "Night, pal," Dean whispered to the photograph. Then he walked upstairs in slow, heavy steps. No one saw the flicker of pain on his face as he disappeared down the hall. No one saw the way his hand gripped the railing to keep from collapsing again. That was the last day he let the world see him break. The years that followed were quiet, too quiet for a man who once made entire cities feel alive. Dean slipped deeper into his mansion, deeper into silence. The phone rang less often. He answered even less. Friends knocked on his door. He rarely opened it. Stevie sent letters. Liza checked in. Quincy called. Sometimes Dean responded. Sometimes he didn't. Mostly, he didn't. Frank visited when he could, but even he noticed the distance growing, not between them, but around Dean himself, like a second skin he couldn't shed. "He's fading," Frank confided to Quincy once. "He's here, but he's fading." Dean stopped performing entirely. Stopped recording. Stopped fighting. When people asked about him, the answer was always the same. He's resting. He's taking time. He's reflecting. But the truth was simpler. Dean Martin was grieving himself out of existence. On Christmas morning, 1995, the world woke to a headline. Dean Martin dead at 78. The official cause was acute respiratory failure. But the people who truly knew him knew better. He had been dying since the day his son's plane went down in 1987. Sammy's death, in 1990, had only sealed the cracks already running through him. Frank Sinatra was too ill to attend the funeral, but he wrote a message to be read aloud, a message that silenced the entire chapel. Dean Martin was the coolest man I ever knew. But he was also the most loving, the most loyal, the most human. He taught me that it's okay to cry. It's okay to break. Because that's what makes us real. Rest easy, Dino. You're with Sammy now. And I'll see you both soon. People cried. Not because a legend had died, but because a man had finally found the peace he'd been searching for through 8 silent, aching years. In 1998, Frank Sinatra passed, and with him, the last heartbeat of the Rat Pack. The era of smoke-filled lounges, midnight laughter, and 3 men who believed they were immortal, finally ended. But one story endured. Not the fame. Not the money. Not the glamour. The story people whispered, the one that refused to fade, was the story of the day Dean Martin's mask fell. Because in that moment, at Sammy's grave, Dean gave the world something he'd never given from a stage, a studio, or a spotlight. He gave them his truth. That even the strongest men break. That even legends grieve. That even kings cry. And sometimes the most unforgettable performance is the moment a man finally lets himself fall apart.